Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Show Me the Money. Right now, we're going to run through an example of everything we've just looked at, right? And we're going to try to put it into context. Sam, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I decided to pick a Canada-UK co-production film. The reason is because when you're getting it into the co-production side, you're going to see a little bit more complex than just a straight film itself. So as we can see, the budget of this film was $15 million US. We break down that budget with what we call the above the line, okay, which includes the key actors and so forth, and $5 million of this above the line, which is a significant portion. And it's not that unusual to have a big above the line part of it. Is $5 million. And that includes $700,000 of producer fees. Okay, so the $700,000 of producer fees, if you look at it, it corresponds more or less to what we had talked about, producers having roughly 10% of what we call the B&C. So what is the B&C? That's the cost of production below the line. The B&C in this situation were $7.2 million. That's really what it cost and it takes to manufacture that film, etc. The costs that are after that are the indirect costs. We had about $1.2 million and other costs of $1.6 million. So that totaled roughly $15 million US. The difference between that budget and what we sometimes call as the cash budget is the cash budget here is $12.9 million. In other words, in this budget itself, it only needed cash, which were third-party costs, of 12.9. $2.1 million of those costs were non-cash items. In other words, we had producer fees of $700,000, okay? Again, 10%, roughly 10% of the B&C. Overhead and administration, $700,000. Again, 10% of the B&C. We're following a little bit of this telefilm model in some of the agencies and the certification agencies who accept this type of structure on producer fees and overheads. And let's say we have a contingency of $700,000. That really is not necessarily non-cash because in every budget, as we know, sometimes there's always a contingency. So I would say to you that the non-cash, even though it's 12.9, that's your minimum non-cash budget. And you're basically having a contingency that could vary between $0 and $700,000. So when you are looking at actually producing this film, you could actually green light this film when you reach your cash budget. Because you know that all the rest of the money is money that is made for you. So we have to raise technically 12.9 and a little bit of the contingency before we can green light the picture. And I'm going to send it over to Jon to see how that finance structure came about after we had this as the basic outline of your budget.
Right. So that's the question, right? If that's the budget, how do we come up with that money? Where are we getting it from? And this is where producers are going to put together a one sheet effectively, which is called the financial structure. And, when we're on the producer side, it's one of the first things we want to see. When we're on the bank side representing a bank or a private lender, it's also one of the first things we want to see. It's an incredibly important document. Now, what that financial structure is going to do is it's going to lay out the various sources of where money, the sum of which is equal to the budget, comes from. So in this example, we have your soft money. Remember we talked about soft money, tax credits, tax incentives. That's what we're talking about here. And this is a Canadian film. Also, it's a UK film. It's a Canadian-UK co-pro, which means that it's eligible for both Canadian tax credits and UK tax credits. And it seems to be over here that it's shooting in Quebec and that there's a lot of spend in Quebec. So we have over here $2.5 million estimated for both Canadian and Quebec tax credits, both on the federal side and the provincial side, and also another $2 million for UK tax credits. And how do they come up with those numbers? Again, it's like we talked about. Typically, an auditor or a chartered accounting firm is going to be engaged. So here you're probably going to have a Canadian accounting firm, which has vetted all of the producers' numbers, probably even issued an opinion to the bank saying, we hereby deem based on everything, or we hereby opine that based on everything that we see, the film is eligible for this amount.
It's based on the expenditures.
Yeah, exactly.
If you remember when we looked a little bit earlier, in Britain, they give you 25% of your British spend. So essentially, if you look at it over here, there'd be about 8 million of British spend on this. And that could give you that $2 million of tax credits itself. And that means that the other amount is about $7.5 million or $7 million. And you'd get maybe about a third of that, which is $2.5 million of the credits between Canada and the Quebec. So this is the type of number. If you actually look at it, between 8 million, let's say in the UK, maybe there's some actor that's there and so forth and partly shot there. And then the rest, maybe there's some special effects in Canada and Quebec to give you that extra little bit amount of money, more than 30%. So it makes sense here that we have $4.5 million on $15 million that comes from soft money.
Exactly. So there's your soft money. And next, it's equity, right? So in this example, it's a UK production fund, which is putting up $2.5 million. Your next item is deferrals, right?
Before you got to that, let's talk a little bit about that, the UK production fund. We had mentioned that in the various jurisdictions, here we have a UK production fund, okay, that's putting up $2.5 million. If you look at that, that's roughly it's about 20%, not 20% of your budget. It's just under 20% of your budget, okay? So that's reasonable. Here, it came from the UK. It could be British Film Institute or something. It could be from Canada. Telefilm has put up money that it's not unreasonable to see in a $15 million film that you'd have Telefilm Canada that supports the film. It's a co-production. It qualifies for content tax credit, qualifies for the investment by different institutions. So $2.5 million, it's a reasonable amount of money if you have a production, some call it risk capital or other type of investor that's going to come in.
Right. So your next item here is a deferral. And again, just recall we talked about how very often there will be a service provider on the film, either a producer, a director, sometimes an actor, sometimes, a post house even, deferring part of their fees, and contrast that with a reinvestment where they actually receive their fees in full and put some of that, they reinvest some of that into the film. So over here, you have a straight deferral from the producer and the executive producer of the film. And like I said before, it's magic. If the producer wants to do it, they could actually just come up with $700,000 by deferring their fee, right? They could just defer their fee straight out, and they've plugged a significant hole in the budget.
And we often see that. The producer has the biggest interest in getting the film done. So it's likely in their situation, if they didn't have full financing, that they would take part of their fees and defer them. Don't forget, they got some admin fees themselves. They maybe have an executive producer that's on board who help finance the film. These executive producers often understand that there's a certain risk involved when they came involved. So it's not unlikely to see something like $700,000 as being a potential deferral on a $15 million film.
And next you have your pre-sales. So like we discussed, these are distribution rights that are sold in advance of the film actually being made. So here you have a couple, right? You have a Canadian pre-sale for $300,000 US. And like we discussed before, since this is going to be a content film, the producer likely wants to they want to check the box that there is an engagement by a Canadian distributor to show the film within 2 years of the year end of the year in which it was produced. So that way, it satisfies the Canadian tax credit requirements.
And the amount of $300,000, which is what, 2%? Like 10% is 1.5 million. Okay. So it's like 2% of the budget. Canada being a small country that isn't off either on getting a type of pre-sale for a country like Canada, especially since it's a content film. So maybe even that $300,000 may not even be coming from a theatrical. It could be, or a major distributor. It could be coming just from a sale to a television broadcaster.
Right. And then you hit this next bullet point, which is others. And, based on the info we have in front of us, you have others for $4 million US. This could play out in a bunch of different ways, right? Like this could be one or two significant territories, like a Germany and US, or a Japan and Germany and France. Really, who knows? It's tough to speculate in this given example. Or what it can be, which is what we often see, is the producer has held back the more lucrative territories and sold 12 of the more minor territories, right? So they'll do like a sale for Benelux, which is Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, maybe Iceland, maybe
Latin America sometimes.
Latvia, Israel. So those are, the smaller territories, and they add up. And that way, they get to hold back the more lucrative sales, which represent a more significant market share, and they get to bet on the upside. They get to say, okay, once we make this film, it's going to be great. Everyone's going to want it, and we're actually going to sell it for more than we would have, 6 months ago before
Your goal,
the film was
if you
made.
want, is to minimize the number of actual sales there, because as we mentioned, every person who is involved in financing that film entity, will probably have to sign what we call an A&D or an NOA. And imagine if you took 20 sales to make $4 million. That meant that when you went to financing your film with your bank, whoever's going to finance these sales, pre-sales, will have to send out 20 of these notices of assignment, and you have to collect the signatures from them to be able to close. So it'd be best if you could close with a smaller amount and raise that $4 million from a smaller amount of territories. Makes your life a little easier when we're going to end up having.
And
to
just
close
so you have an
financing.
idea, I mean, we have done those deals, probably between both of us collectively. It's not atypical to have between 10 and 20 sales, right? But what it requires on our end, remember, these are entities all around the world in every single time zone. It's a lot of work to close that many deals, especially under a tight delay.
And we're going to ask you to do it, though. We're going to prepare the document. You as the producer is going to have to run and get them. but we have to be around to be able to help out also, because sometimes they negotiate it. Don't forget, there's 20 different people that receive it. They negotiate it. It may take a long time to get all of those closed up.
Right. But that's what's sold. Now let's talk about what's unsold. The gap, right? Those gap refers to unsold territories, right?
And if you look at the percentage,
that's
so you have 3 million over 15 million. That's 20%. Yeah, it's not a bad.
So that's your gap, and you're going to have a gap financier here in place, right? Your gap financier is coming in, and they're saying, okay, I mean, you haven't sold territories X, Y, Z, A, B, C, but we're going to lend against those unsold territories. It's going to be at a higher interest rate, but we're willing to take that risk. And like you said before, Sam, in an earlier episode, yes, banks do this, but very often it winds up being these non-institutional lenders, i.e. lenders who are not chartered banks.
Well, that's what we're going to now. Let's have a look and see who's going to be, how did they finance this film itself? So let's look at the allocation of the bank financing. In this case, we had a UK bank that was the lead bank. Okay, it brought in a $5.6 million US credit facility. It decided to do 100% of the pre-sales itself. Okay, and 80% of the tax credits in the UK. So essentially, it banked the whole amount of what was the pre-sales, and it left a little bit of money on the UK tax credit. Now, when you look at it, what's going to happen when we get to close this thing, okay, is that 20% of the UK tax credits, we had UK tax credits of $2 million. I now see another $400,000 that's missing here to close the bank facility. So apart from some money of the deferred that came in, that producer who had contingency and overhead, right, may need to dip into their overheads and contingency to finance that other 80%. So essentially, there is a little bit of a missing amount of money to actually close this deal. But that's what the UK bank would do. So it would probably have to be first position on all those pre-sales, which means that the UK bank is sending out those A&Ds and those notices of assignment. The UK bank will have their own lawyers, a set of lawyers that are looking at it. The UK bank will probably need to deal with the Canadian bank and the gap financiers, okay, on this thing. But they're the ones that are taking the lead. They're going to be the ones that will be mortgaging the copyright of the film also, and getting a security package on it. The Canadian bank is coming in with a credit facility of Canadian to 2.4 million. It's financing 90% of the Canadian tax credits and 100% of the Canadian pre-sale. So again, we see a little missing 10% of those Canadian credits, which is about $250,000. So I have $400,000 that is not financed from the UK. I have $250,000 that's not financed by the Canadian tax credits. That's basically $650,000. If we go back a little bit to remember when we had the breakdown of the budget, if you look at it, producer fees of $700,000 was already deferred. They had $700,000 of overhead and admin in here. Well, that $700,000 is just enough to cover those $650,000, which are not financed by the bank. And that you realize only once you get the bank letters and your offer of financing, that you realize that you don't have that money right away. So the producer technically may have to come in and defer $650,000 additional not to complete the financing structure, but to close the bank. And the reason they need to is because usually you'll have a bond company that comes in, because the bank's now here. They need to have the film completed to be able to collect all of this. So there is a bond company on this deal. That bond company will determine what is called the strike price. The strike price, again, is equal to what it will cost to complete and deliver this film. If you look at it, technically, the strike price would be reduced essentially by the non-cash part of the budget, but they'll need some contingency. So the bond will want contingency, okay? And they'll reduce it also by the $700,000 deferred. So all of the other amounts of money have to be available to the bond, which means that the bank money that's not financed, which is the 20% of the tax credits and the other 10%, have to be assured that the bond will have that not be payable. So the bond will ask that anybody who is getting paid, and who has the deferrals and any one of these missing amounts of the financing, will sign what is called a postponement letter until the credits come in. So essentially, it's really waiting for the credits to come in for the producer to get the rest of the money. So that's the Canadian bank. Canadian bank has a loan offer coming in. It's going to take security on the Canadian tax credits. It's going to take security on the Canadian pre-sale with their NOAs. That's probably where we've come in. Sometimes we are the ones that are redrafting the Canadian bank part, or we're on the borrower side with the producer, and we're going to be dealing with counsel on the bank side, both the Canadian bank and the UK bank side. So those are the two. Then we're looking at the gap lender. That gap lender in this case was actually a third party. So we actually have three parties coming in here: a UK bank, a Canadian bank, and a third party gap who's bringing in $3 million. The $3 million is again an offer that's coming from that bank, that gap financier. What did the gap financier want? First position recoupment for the world, excluding Canada. Now, the world can't be completely the world. It's the unsold territories, because all the pre-sales, it's the rest of the world, ROW we call it, okay? Excluding Canada. And Canada has also been pre-financed. So in this situation, what will the gap financier want? The gap financier will want a sales agent who comes on board, okay, and says, I'm going to give you sales projections of $6 million for the rest of this film. So if you look at reality, $6 million, we've sold $4.3 million of the film. $6 million means that there's $10 million. This film doesn't even have to make back its budget, and you're able to finance this film through this gap financing. And that's because of the fact that there is the soft money that's come in that's reduced the actual cost of this film. So he'll need that sales agent on board. He'll want that sales agent to make sales as much as possible for $3 million, to be the first ones that gets the money. And he'll be the first one. He or it will be the first money that gets paid out. So when you're looking at the agreement between these banks and these lenders and this gap, what are they going to say? The intercreditor, interparty, we can predict from this over here, it's going to say the first monies coming from the world ROW will go to the gap financier. Any monies coming from the Canadian presale will go to the Canadian bank. Any monies coming from Canadian credits go to Canadian bank. Any monies going from those contracted presales will go to the UK bank. Now, those contracted presales, it could be that they don't come through. Somebody may falter or default on not paying. That territory will still be reserved for the UK bank. That's going to be provided in the intercreditor agreement, interparty agreement, that basically sets out who gets the money. That UK production fund, okay, that came in, they would want to be after these. So in other words, the UK bank is first, the Canadian bank is first on their financing, the gap is first on all the sales. Who comes after that? That UK risk capital, that lender, or the telefilm that may have brought in some money. After that, you'll have, if you look at it, the finance structure, you'll have probably the deferred who comes in and says, hey, I deferred some money. I should be paid before the rest of the people are getting paid who have the equity. So you've got the UK fund and the deferreds for the balance itself. So this is essentially, when you look at it, how that money that they've put up is now going to be shared once that film is produced and that film starts generating revenue, and that film then hopefully is successful, because the producer who did this isn't received any money yet. And they have to receive all of that money before. And if you were involved in a film financing, let's say as an individual or person, and you wonder sometimes why you hear that films who make, I don't know, $50 million a box office, even though the film cost $15 million, okay, would not have recouped all of its money over here, right? What would be your projection? $50 million. Would we see some money here if we had invested in this film?
Hollywood accounting, who knows, right? But I think the point is, and we may have touched on this, like, to see a return, right? It takes a lot. Well, it happens.
The 50 million of box office, right, is cut in
half to 25.
25 million.
Right away, right? Because of box office remittance rates.
Right, it's 50%. So out of that 25 million, they had to spend prints and advertising, right? All of that has to come out first, right? So another 10 million, let's say, we're at 15 million. The sales agent, he's not going to work for free, right? And all the people who are selling these films, the distributor usually charges a commission.
Off
that
the top.
commission is off, exactly. So all of a sudden, if I'm making another $25 million or 50 million and I have a 35% commission, I have another 15 million. Technically, I'm zero. I have no money. 50 million, half of it is 25, 10 million for prints and ads, 15 million for the distributor credit, $0 are left for the producer on a $50 million box office.
That's not to say, of course, that certain movies don't make money, right? They do. Yeah. And when they do, they tend to make a lot. But I think what Sam is getting at here is I'm a big believer in the saying, when there's an elephant in the room, address the elephant, right? What that means is, if there is an obstacle, if something is hard, the best way to overcome that challenge is by knowing that the challenge exists, right? If an iceberg is in front of you and you're on a ship, I'd rather know that the iceberg is there, and I'd rather know that it's there as far out as possible, because then I could just sort of turn around it and I'm good. So I think it's important for filmmakers to know the challenges so that they can address them. And if there's one thing that this podcast has really been about, in addition to informing listeners and viewers about the industry generally and some of the legal aspects, it's about what some of the challenges are. And once those challenges once they're made aware of them, hopefully they can address them too, right?
And if you see them far enough ahead, like you just said, for that iceberg, yes, plan ahead and make sure that once it's done, okay, that there is you reserve some and see how you can fit on the money part, because hopefully one of the things that we try to also show you is where is the money on this podcast, and how you can, now that you know a little bit more about it, place yourself in such a situation, whether you are the producer, you could be an investor, or you could be on a lending side. But once you've seen this and you've followed it through and followed that money through, it's really how understanding that component then can make you act and be a better investor and hopefully a better producer from it.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for listening, everyone.
Yeah. Thank
Been
you.
fun.
And hopefully we can help you show the money.